Why download more RAM when you could just download more frames per second directly? That's the claim of lossless scaling. It sounds like it must be too good to be true. It must be a scam, and frankly, there are some drawbacks. However, with its latest update, lossless scaling does offer a 4x frame generation mode, which does increase the number of frames per second that you're seeing on your screen. It also claims a big update allowing now G-Sync compatibility, which is huge. Let's go ahead and test out this latest update. So does this do what it claims to do? Well, let's check it out. So you download the Lossless Scaling app off Steam. If you don't already own it, it costs about $6. We can set the frame generation mode to ×4, and I'm also going to turn on G-Sync support, which is one of the claimed new features, one of the first things I want to look at here. Then I'll go ahead and click Scale, and what's going to happen is after 5 seconds, you notice our frame rate number is going to jump up significantly, and now we're also, because I've set lossless scaling to draw its frame rate, going to see two numbers in the top left corner. The one on the far left is the amount of frames the game itself is actually rendering, and the number to the right of that is how many frames are being displayed on the monitor. And one reason why I've got another frame rate counter going on here in the bottom left, and one reason why I'm filming the screen directly, is because of the claimed variable refresh rate support. So in previous versions of lossless scaling, you didn't have variable refresh rate support nicely, whereas now we should have it. This is my monitor's on-screen display, and it shows that variable refresh rate is on, and it shows the frame rate that the monitor is running at, and I can kind of turn off that big obnoxious display and show that frame rate counter here. The reason why I'm doing that and filming the screen directly is because now we can see that the number here roughly matches the number there. They're going to be slightly out of sync because I don't think they're updating at the same pace at the exact same moment, but they're fairly close, indicating that the monitor is correctly following the frame rate that the game, that lossless scaling is outputting, so meaning that we do now have G-Sync support operating correctly on this display. And the other way I can confirm it is just panning around. I'm not seeing the type of screen tearing I would see if it was not accurately using G-Sync. Now, my monitor is currently running in 1080p 480 Hertz mode, so it does support frame rates this high. If your frame rate went above your monitor's max refresh rate, you might again see issues and you want to cap below that. So is the G-Sync support working? I've got to say it looks like it is. Another reason why I'm filming the screen directly, though, is because to show a variable refresh rate experience on YouTube is actually impossible. YouTube runs at a fixed frame rate of either 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second, and the content that I'm seeing with my eyes in person, and you would be if you were using this, is running at a variable refresh rate, and a refresh rate that is very different than what YouTube sees. So for a lot of this, I'm filming the screen directly to try to get you as best of an experience as I can, and I'm doing it using a high refresh rate camera, but everything that I do in the end is going to be crushed back down to a 60 FPS output that's fixed for your YouTube viewing experience. So I'll describe what I'm seeing as well as I can, and I'll show it as well as I can, but just keep in mind, a YouTube video cannot accurately describe what's going on here. Now, another thing we can talk about is the downside. So we are getting a massive frame rate bump. The monitor is following it, so why would you maybe not want to use this? Watch this crosshair. When I pan back and forth, do you guys see that it garbles? There's image quality issues with that. And that's not the only place you'll see it. Anywhere you see, like this gun, you can see it kind of blur and look kind of bad in motion. And the faster the motion is on screen, the worse certain things can look. Now, different people are going to find this more or less distracting than others, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, this is an issue with the way that we are boosting frame rates. What is it doing when it boosts your frame rate, right? This seems like magic, it's too good to be true. Well, what it does is it generates intermediate frames in between the frames the game is actually rendering. So the game actually renders 2 frames, and then lossless scaling intercepts those 2 frames, thinks about what would happen in between those 2 frames, makes its best guess, and in this case, for the ×4 mode, it guesses what the 3 equally spaced out frames would have been in between the 2 frames the game actually produced. And that's why we get more frames on screen, meaning that this feels and looks very smooth in motion as long as you don't look at the fine details. When you look at the fine details, it's because there are errors in the game's guess at what would happen. Now, this happens with all types of frame generation, but it's particularly likely to make errors like that, and the errors will be more noticeable in apps like Lossless Scaling, or even AMD's driver level AFMF fluid motion frames that run at the driver level. Now, that's because this app doesn't have access to the game's motion vectors. It doesn't have a way to separate HUD elements from the game itself. It has to kind of guess and interpret what's going on without that much information. Let me demonstrate what happens if I turn this off. So if I turn this off, I mean, I don't know if this comes through in a 60 FPS YouTube video, but I can tell there's a lot more gaps between frames, meaning I'm running at a lower motion fluidity, a lower frame rate, but the crosshair doesn't garble. Things look more stable in motion, even if the motion itself is, choppier, if that kind of makes sense. There's less errors in the image. Now, let's compare this to something like DLSS 3 frame generation. DLSS frame generation, which is supported in this game if you have a 40 series NVIDIA card, is going to also boost our frame rates. Notice here, the frame rate's boosting to, over 100 frames per second. It's variable, it's bouncing around, but notice it's not as high of a frame rate as what we were getting from lossless frame generation, because DLSS just generates one intermediate frame, whereas lossless scaling was trying to generate 3. So there are definitely frame rate advantages to lossless scaling. However, if I pan this in motion and you watch the crosshair, the crosshair is stable. That's because DLSS 3 is integrated directly into the game, and it has access to the game's information, which means that it's able to tell what a HUD element is in a way that lossless scaling just has to guess. It also has more motion vectors available for where things are going to give better guesses at what those intermediate frames will look like. And therefore, the quality of the generated frames is better with DLSS than it is with lossless scaling. And the same would be true of FSR3 frame generation that's actually built into games, as opposed to something like AFMF, which is at the driver level and suffers from the same issues as lossless scaling does. So I would still think I would use the DLSS frame generation before I would use the lossless frame generation, because despite the lower overall frame rate boost, the quality of the frames is a lot better. Now, another thing we need to talk about is the other downside besides image quality for frame generation is latency. Because it's generating intermediate frames, it has to wait to get a frame that the game was otherwise ready to show on your screen, and it delays showing that to you while it generates the intermediate frames, which means that your game's response to what you do that you see on your screen is actually slower than if you weren't using frame generation at all, which is why I get a lot of people talking about using things like this in a competitive shooter. But I would argue that even an application like DLSS frame generation or FSR3 frame generation, let alone something like lossless scaling, should not be used in competitive multiplayer games because it actually slows down when you see something on the screen. There is a latency penalty. However, how bad is it? Well, that depends on how high your base frame rate is before you use it. Because if there's less of a gap between the real frames, it doesn't have to wait as long when it delays and shows you what's going on in intermediate stuff in between. So here with the base frame rate of around 60 or so, and then we kick this on, if I move my mouse around and kind of feel when it kicks in, I can instantly tell when it kicks in, even without the frame rate counter, because I see the motion fluidity is suddenly much better. I start seeing the garbling on the mouse cursor immediately as well, and I also just feel that the mouse is a little bit heavier for aiming. That being said, with a base frame rate this high, around 60-ish, it's definitely still completely playable. Like, I'm able to aim at these random poor citizens as as I walk around. I guess the game doesn't let me shoot children. That's probably for the best. But anyway, if I randomly start fighting, targeting things, like I feel like I can play the game. It's not too objectionable. But the lower your base frame rate is, the worse that experience is going to be, and thus just keep that in mind. This isn't a magic solution to go from, 30 frames per second to 120 frames per second without the game feeling kind of heavy. Also, this kind of begs the question of, wait a minute, we've got an inbuilt frame generation if I'm on a 40 series NVIDIA card, and lossless scaling can do frame generation as well. Yeah, you actually can do both, and let's go ahead and try that out. So if we do that, we actually are going to now be pushing over 300 frames per second of motion fluidity on the screen. However, I don't recommend doing this, and the reason is, well, twofold. One is latency, because right now my mouse feels really heavy despite a fairly high base frame rate. I mean, at least not as low as it could be. And it makes it a bit hard to aim. Now, some people might not find it impossible, so maybe there are some people who would like doing this, but I wouldn't really recommend it, because why is that happening? Well, DLSS frame generation is also, waiting to show you a frame and then interpreting what happened in between and displaying that. So there's a latency penalty for using DLSS frame generation. And then the order of operation that's being applied here is those generated frames are now feeding into lossless scaling, which then also delays showing you a frame to do its generation of frames, of intermediate frames. So we're stacking the latency twice. So while the frame rate number goes way up, the feel of playing the game like this, I would say, goes way down. Like, I can still kind of aim in this fight and stuff, but I have to the mouse just feels heavy. That's all I can say about it. The mouse feels very heavy. It's throwing off my aim. Again, maybe some people are in certain games or certain types of games, you'd want to play around with it. Also, you have the issue of DLSS frame generation also has image quality artifacts within it, even if they're not as bad as lossless scaling. And now you're sending some of those already slightly wrong frames into lossless scaling frame generation, which it then uses as a baseline to scale from. And guess what's happening? So it's not only stacking latency, it's also stacking image quality problems. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, overall for myself, I think in most games, I would probably not use lossless scaling, especially not like this, but even just normally, and even if I didn't have a 40 series GPU, personally, I do find the image quality a bit of a hit. I find things like that distracting. However, there are certain games where I think this actually shines. So I think Elden Ring and other games like it are a uniquely interesting application of this type of frame generation. For one thing, there's no frame generation built into this game at all, so you wouldn't have the option of using another one that was inbuilt into the game. But also this game is capped to 60 frames per second. So this is running at 4K on a 4090. The 4090 could certainly go above 60 frames per second in this game, but the game just doesn't go above that unless you use like a frame unlocking mod or something like that. Now, the cool thing then, though, is that, well, we can use lossless scaling to go ahead and kick on the ×4 frame generation mode. And here, the other really cool thing is that as you watch this kick in, it is really going to go from 60 to 240, meaning it is actually giving me an entire 4 times frame rate bump compared to what we were doing before we clicked the button. Whereas if you had noticed what was going on in the Cyberpunk tests, when you activate the frame generation, there's a performance cost to doing that, which it then multiplies by 4. Meaning you're not multiplying your base frame rate by 4, you're multiplying your frame rate after the performance hit to using frame generation occurs. Whereas in a game like this, where my GPU had headroom above 60 frames per second, and then I use this frame generation, well, the GPU had extra headroom. So it could still do 60 frames per second. This will obviously depend on your GPU. And then it will then multiply that by 4, meaning I'm getting a true 4 times the number of frames viewed on screen. Also, I can instantly tell the motion fluidity of the game does look smooth. And the other thing is, this is a game I'm playing with on a controller. A controller, in my opinion, is much less noticeable when there's latency penalties. So while all types of frame generation have latency issues, latency penalties, I've just noticed that compared to using a mouse, a controller feels a lot less of the latency. I just don't really notice it. I don't have any problem with the latency right now, and I'm going from 60 to 240. Now, also, because there's not like a crosshair in the middle of the screen, I don't see that artifacting all the time, which is less noticeable. However, I will say that if I just pan the camera, you can see like this weird fuzzy halo around the character and on the sides of the screens. Now, that's most noticeable when I'm just doing a quick camera pan around the character, and it's much less noticeable when I'm running in a straight line actually, playing the game. So if I was, just fighting in combat, I'm really not focused on those little details, and they're also just less apparent at all when you're playing in this manner versus just doing a camera pan. So, in other words, there's still image quality concerns to take into account, but I think in a game like this, I would be much more likely to actually use this because I'm getting, like I said, I'm actually getting 4 times the number of frames on the screen, giving me 4 times the motion fluidity at a minor cost to image quality, depending on what I'm doing. Again, some people will find this a lot more distracting than others. And then, like I said, there is a latency penalty, but again, playing on a controller, not really feeling it. So my overall thoughts on lossless scaling is that it's still going to be a pretty niche use case. However, I think a lot of people will end up liking it better than I do in a lot of games where I wouldn't use it personally. So I think it's worth checking out for yourself, but it's definitely not going to be for everybody, not going to be for every game. But I think there are, like I said, like Elden Ring, certain games that are frame rate limited where it can really shine, especially if the style of the gameplay lends itself to not really showing a lot of those image quality artifacts that you would otherwise see, and if it's a game that you would be playing on a controller rather than with a mouse and keyboard, which kind of hides some of the latency issues. So anyway, I think this is a really cool app. The other thing I should mention at the end of the video is lossless scaling existed before frame generation was even a part of the app. It also just has a lot of really cool scalers built in for just scaling resolutions, and some of these are really useful for cool niche things as well as others, so you could definitely take a look at that, as it really is an interesting scaler, and that's where the lossless name came from in general, was giving you lossless integer scaling and things like that versus frame generation, which of course does cause some loss to image quality. But anyway, let me know what you guys think about this. I've seen a lot of positive notes about it in the comment section, but again, the key takeaways are it really does have the ability to 4x your frame rate, as we're seeing here. It really does now operate nicely with Gsync in my testing. And it does certainly have its use cases where I think it makes sense. However, if you're playing a game that has FSR 3 or DLSS 3 frame generation built into the game, I do think you get cleaner image quality out of that, despite those technologies not yet offering this level of ×4 frame rate benefit. But you do get the fewer image quality artifacts, which I think would be more worth it. Anyway, I think the most direct competitor to this is AMD's Fluid Motion Frames driver level support, which is interesting, but again, that's only for AMD users. So if you're on an NVIDIA GPU, this is probably the closest thing you can get to that, and even AMD users might want to try this out compared with the driver level offering from AMD in games that just don't have a built-in FSR 3 integration. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope everybody has an excellent day. Oh yeah, and if you want to support the testing and news and everything that I do on the channel, feel free to hit the join button down below to directly support the channel financially, and in return you get like member badges and early access to some videos and all that cool stuff. So, hope everybody has an excellent day.